Hi everyone, thanks again for connecting. The time is 7:33 a.m. in Boston. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on the time zone that you're connecting on. So let's get started. Welcome to another webinar organized by CNC. I'm João Quirapinha, market access scientist at CNC. We're a specialist market access firm devoted to strengthening emerging pharmaceutical markets. We arrange these webinars to share specialist knowledge in the areas of pharmacoeconomics, market access, pricing and reimbursement, and also methods related thereto. As always, it's a pleasure to introduce the next webinar. Terry Matulis has very kindly agreed to present on what makes a good systematic review and meta-analysis. Terry will talk to us about the nuts and bolts of what to look for in a high-quality systematic review and meta-analysis, beginning with a few focused research questions that helps the reader understand why we need this type of paper in generating evidence. She'll also cover the study selection, inclusion and exclusion criteria, search strategies, and touch on some of the pitfalls related to systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Terry Matulis is the managing editor of Current Medical Research and Opinion, and also the Journal of Drug Assessment. Terry has over 15 years of experience in medical publishing, both as an editor and then also as a writer. Terry serves on the Publishing Ethics Committee for the International Society of Medical Publication Professionals, and she has also served as a reviewer for the Good Publications Practice Guidelines, GPP3, and the Gut-Kin Manual, a medical publishing professional's guide for creating high-caliber manuscripts. So, Terry Matulis, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to share your knowledge and your experience as well. I'm going to hand over the presenter role to you.
So I will just start the slideshow. Okay.
Great. You're all set.
There you go. So as Joel kindly said, I am managing editor of Current Medical Research and Opinion. Before I got into publishing, I was a critical care nurse and certified in critical care. So understanding all of this stuff for me from having clinical experience at the bedside is really helpful. I have to put a caveat on this. Where did that? I want to go back. There. And what I'm telling you here, because it's from a publisher's perspective, I'm not a researcher, I don't do these heavy statistical analyses on these things, but I can tell you that by the end of this, you will know, hopefully, what goes in, how to answer that question, what makes a really good systematic review and meta-analysis. So those are my objectives for this. I understand that some people use systematic review and meta-analysis interchangeably to mean the same thing, and I thought I would clarify a few of these terms. So my first objective then is to show you the narrative versus systematic review and meta-analysis, and then the key elements that comprise a systematic review and the ways to conduct a meta-analysis. So moving right along. And I know my slides are probably a little information dense, but that's because I have need to write everything out. So here's the basic difference between a narrative and a systematic review. If you hadn't already known this, the systematic review will focus on a single question. Can you hear me, or did somebody?
We hear you perfectly. Thanks, Terry.
Okay, good. You can see these differences, but the systematic review is a heavy endeavor. It focuses on a single question. It should have its own registered protocol. It takes more than 12 months to complete. Its methods have to be clear and reproducible, and it should try and systematically appraise the quality of selected articles using methods to reduce selection bias and so forth. The narrative review is just simply like a bird's eye view of a topic, and has no study protocol, no methods, uses selected studies based on the author's personal preference, and often covers the pathophysiology and epidemiology of the topic. So protocols for, let's see, where am I? I'm sorry about that. This is so early in the morning for me. Anyway, conclusions from a narrative review are drawn generally rely on expert opinion. Conclusions from a systematic review generally are a synthesis of the data that they found, and are much more objective. Both of these articles are categorized for publishing purposes as review articles. So you can have a systematic review without a meta-analysis, and I sent along, actually I could probably send it to the participants after this, but I sent along to Joe an example of a systematic review that we published in CMRO that did not have a meta-analysis associated with it. Okay, a closer look at a systematic review. That clear research question should be formulated before the study is started. It should be based on a PICOS, which is the patients or participants, the interventions. Let me see. This is how to do comparisons. Where am I getting at? My notes here off to the side. Sorry, Joe. Anyway, comparisons, outcomes, and the study design. PO is just the patients or participants' interventions and outcomes. And the search, it should be a systematic search of the entire literature as much as possible. Ideally, people should be using more than preferably 4 databases. Are you familiar with the databases? MBase, Medline, Medline in Process, and CINAHL, and there's many, many others. But the idea is to search as much as possible everything, including gray literature, which is abstract posters, unpublished studies, and stuff like that. The search criteria should flow from the question, and the reasons for inclusion and exclusion should be documented, as well as the inclusion dates. And of course, finally, the critical appraisal of the papers requires at least 2 reviewers to decrease bias, and they should have inter-rater reliability, for example. All right, I had actually for this slide, I had picked out exactly what CMR looks for in a review. It's just being very difficult here. My notes are being very difficult. Okay. Here's what we look for in a systematic review. We want a clear objective. We want the introduction should have the necessary background information and end with the objective that sets out to answer that distinct clinical question. What did I do? I hit one. Sorry about that. And we wouldn't know if the question was formulated a priori or not, but generally authors will add that information to the introduction, but it's not a deal breaker. The question must be, like I said, PO or PICO based, and the methods then, we require a systematic review to have a methods section in the abstract and in the main body. It should list the databases used, and to be truly comprehensive and decrease publication bias, the researcher should look for all unpublished studies, even ongoing trials. In the results section, back in the methods section, we want to see their the summary of the selected trials, a table with the summary. Their PRISMA diagram has to be there. And PRISMA is the reporting guidelines for systematic reviews and meta-analyses that you can find on the Equator Network. If you're not familiar with that, let me know, and I can give you a link to that. The results section should describe the results, and even the methods section should also have any statistics used. And the results section should describe the search results and move on to the study range and characteristics, study quality, and finally discuss the effect of the interventions on the outcomes. The discussion section should summarize the main findings from the review and discuss the limitations of the study and the reliability of the results. CMRO requires people to have a separate conclusion from the discussion, and it has to be a concise statement of the clinical implications of the study's results. We ask authors to ensure that the extrapolations are reasonable and the conclusions justified by the data presented. So on to meta-analysis. Generally, a meta-analysis is a subset of a systematic review. However, any data sets can be combined. So meta-analysis encompasses also more than a systematic review. So I'm sorry, this is not really. I, okay. Most of the medical research is most often used to analyze individual patient data, which is data coming directly from original trials or researchers responsible for the study, or aggregated data, which generally stems from the results of published studies, like randomized controlled trials and so forth. And meta-analysis on aggregate data is the most common and generally most often what CMRO publishes. So each meta-analysis should fulfill several key requirements to ensure the validity of its results. It has to have and it's all dependent on the systematic review. So well-defined objectives, including precise definitions of the clinical variables and outcomes, an appropriate and well-documented study identification and selection strategy, and evaluation of the bias in the identification and selection of studies. There's actually tools that researchers use to control for bias. Justification of any analytic techniques and use of sensitivity analyses. Why do some systematic reviews have a meta-analysis and others do not? That's a key question that I'm asked a lot of times. It's because that systematic review probably is asking different questions or using different designs such as randomized or non-randomized trials, and likely information that shouldn't be combined or pooled. So that's the deal there. Meta-analysis is not like a simple pooled analysis where individual studies are not weighted before they're combined. A variety of statistical models are used to evaluate the data. The paper that results from a systematic review meta-analysis is categorized as an original article. Some of the statistical models used, I am not gifted in this at all, but direct comparisons generally, if you're comparing two groups that are basically similar groups, they'll use either a fixed effect model or random effects model. The random effects model is used most often in studies that have a lot of heterogeneity, or the differences, different patient groups have different characteristics. Indirect comparisons are something that is just boomerang. It's just exploding nowadays with network meta-analyses. That includes the indirect and mixed treatment comparisons, matching adjusted indirect comparisons, and these are studies that are often done on drugs that have had no head-to-head comparisons. So based on drug A is studied against a placebo, say a pain drug A is studied against a placebo, pain drug B is studied against a placebo. Network meta-analysis allows these two drugs to be compared indirectly and make conclusions about their efficacy, their safety, and sometimes their cost. So they use different high-level statistics like Bayesian models, and frequentist multivariate models, I guess, are used less often now, but they're still around. Some of these models have caused me a big pain in the neck because there's ways to do it correctly and ways to not do it correctly, which I'll get to in a moment. Okay. Finally, the pitfalls to consider that we come across often in CMRO are a lot of bias, the publication bias versus selection bias. Publication bias is incurred because there's studies out there that just haven't been published and people don't have access to them, such as negative studies. It's hard to kind of find all of that literature that never sees the light of day, and that will cause bias in systematic review and meta-analysis paper. Selection bias, we've had that happen oftentimes. We had an author who was so excited about her findings that the peer reviewers felt that the fear was the bias may have pervaded the author's conclusions because of the selected studies. Another pitfall to consider is very poor quality studies that probably really shouldn't be combined, or small studies. There's this thing called the small study effect. So a small study, if it's used in a meta-analysis, will skew the results toward the positive side. That's an actual phenomenon that has been written about in much of the literature. Too much heterogeneity is always a problem in trying to draw conclusions from pooled data. if the characteristics of the patient populations are not similar or they're so dissimilar, it's hard to draw any strong conclusions from such patient populations. And that, the naive direct comparison, that is, like I said, caused me a lot of problems. That's where authors have compared two drugs in a network and meta-analyses and compared them as if they had the same characteristics of everything the same across the board, when in fact they did not. And that leads to also misleading results. The biggest complaint I see for meta-analyses and network meta-analyses and systematic review is the lack of novelty. There is a ton of literature coming out of various areas of the world that are just rehashing the same systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have already been done, even so much as to selecting the same papers and evaluating and getting the same results. So there's a flood of literature that shouldn't see the light of day, that's just kind of copycatting what's already been done. So updates of systematic reviews and meta-analyses are fine, but unfortunately I'm seeing a lot of things that just confirm the obvious. So, in that said, I hope, it's my hope that you see that a systematic review is a huge endeavor. And the quality of the meta-analysis and review depends on that systematic review and if everything was done right, if they've controlled for bias, if they've included the correct studies, excluded the correct studies. There should, like I said, be their PRISMA statement so that you can see the data and how it flows. And the meta-analyses, the main thing with that is to select the appropriate statistical method to analyze and combine the data. So that's really all I have, Joe. I'm sorry this was, I thought I would be more awake for this than I am, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Terry, that's very useful. I was wondering if you could share some useful resources that attendees could draw on to prevent the problem of lack of novelties. So before they do a systematic review and consider doing a meta-analysis, or what should they be looking at first as online resources?
Well, there's a ton of online resources out there, and I can send some links over after this is over. You should check out the Equator Network. The Cochrane Library has a whole ton of resources for how to conduct a systematic review and meta-analyses that you can just, I believe, download free. And likewise with the Equator Network. They're really set up to be very helpful to people. And there's actual tools, so to watch out for those pitfalls and biases and stuff like that, there's actual tools that will control for bias. And a lot of, if you look at, I think that PLOM paper that I sent you, you will see, if you, I wish I could have actually brought that up into my slides, you can see what they did throughout that whole study and how they have selected for bias, how they have inter-rater reliability between the two people. So when they've selected studies and they extract the data on a systematic review, they have people, at least 2 reviewers, pulling it out and reviewing independently all of the data. And then they try to resolve difference in the inter-rater reliability between those 2 people, or even 3 people, as it may sometimes happen. And then they use a tool that's actually something like, I want to say an app software or something that helps resolve that bias. It's very interesting, it's very involved, and by the time I get it, all I see is all the end result of all their hard work. So I can look in the methods section and I can look, did they do this, did they do that, did they control for this, control for that, and it's very fascinating, but all the underlying work underneath there, it's so interesting, and just the sheer amount of work that goes into it. You wonder why, and I wondered why more people wouldn't do meta-analyses on every systematic review, but I realized that that's, can't happen for some papers.
Absolutely. And are there useful how-to manuals that you think are go-to resources that attendees could possibly use in their work?
Yeah, like I said, the Cochrane Library has tons of, you
Okay.
have to go, I'll send those links to you,
Okay.
but Stephen Gutkin, this guy who was supposed to do this presentation, not me, is a medical writer, and he had his own biomedical research company called Reef Biomedical, so it was a medical communications company that he owned, and in the interim, before he closed his business, he wrote a book that's coming out, and we will be publishing that book. I thought it would be out in November, but it's actually not coming out till February, where he has all of these resources and everything in one spot. When that book comes out, I'll definitely share it with you, but there's a ton of information on the internet. So if you Google Equator Network, you will find it. If you Google Cochrane and systematic reviews, and you'll find tons of stuff. So I can, after this is over, send you links, or if you want to push out to everybody, or if they want to email me directly, I can definitely point people in the right direction.
Okay. Okay, got it. So we're going to open up the lines for any questions that attendees may have. There may be some feedback, so we may selectively mute or unmute you. So we're going to open up the lines if there's any questions from attendees. Okay, so the lines are being opened up, and are there any questions that you'd like to ask Terry directly?
Yeah, this is Dr. Jyoti here.
Yes.
I want to know if there are if too much heterogeneity in the studies.
Mm-hmm.
How do we overcome that?
Well, there's a ton of statistical ways around heterogeneity, or at least to account for it. Sensitivity analyses, some of the other, like I said, I'm not all gifted. I think the random, let me just see, the random.
So you mean there are statistical tools to overcome?
Yes, there's other analyses that you can do to add on to your study to try to control for heterogeneity. Excuse me? And the authors will sometimes be asked to add a sensitivity analysis, or are going to be asked to do something to control for heterogeneity. Sometimes there's too much heterogeneity and it just cannot be controlled for.
Right.
But I can get you answers to that too. I can dig in and find a study with heterogeneity and just show you what they did. But generally, forest plots, the sensitivity analyses, I forget what other control for that.
So the way we try to understand heterogeneity in economic analysis, particularly in health technology assessment or pharmacoeconomics, is the inclusion of that sensitivity analysis, which is probably one of the most critical parts of the economic model to understand its variability and how it changes under different conditions. Terry, the question that I had for you is the inclusion of a sensitivity analysis a typical and recommended part of a meta-analysis to understand that variability?
It's very often a recommended part of it.
Okay.
However, there have been studies that we've gotten where it hasn't been included for whatever reason, and the peer reviewers will call authors out on that. In fact, one industry-sponsored piece of research that we got didn't have a sensitivity analysis, and should have, and we got letters on that paper. It was awful. How I even got through without it.
Okay. All right, got you. And the Equator Network and the Cochrane review material will have some resource guides on how to conduct that sensitivity analysis, right?
They should have.
Okay.
I mean, there is a ton of things the Equator Network should have. And let's see, I was out there the other day. Anyway, they have how to conduct these from soup to nuts on the internet, and lots of guidance.
That's fantastic. Okay, great. So if there aren't any further questions, Dr. Jyoti, are you good? Do you have any other questions from your end?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
You're good. Okay. All right. Thanks so much. So thanks so much, Tara. Really appreciate it. It's always useful to get the inside scoop, as it were, from you, given that you're a managing editor and that you see many of these publications on a day-to-day basis. So your experience and your expertise in this area is highly appreciated and welcomed. And thanks very much for putting together the slides. A note to the participants, Terry has shared her email address on her last slide. She's open to being contacted directly if you have any questions related to today's presentation. Terry will also share with us the resource links, online links to the Gutman, well, when it's published next year, February.
Yeah, right. I wanted to do that. Oh my gosh, that was because he was our expert, who we were going to get to do this, and he goes, you can do it. But my problem is I see the end result of all this work that's done underneath. So one thing, too, if you have questions and I was unable to answer them, I have a bevy of experts that I can get in touch with and get your questions answered. So feel free to email.
Got it. Fantastic. So thanks so much for the insightful presentation, Tara. Again, really appreciate it. And thank you all for connecting. If you'd like to be notified of future webinars, please be sure to subscribe to our newsletter on www.carapinion.com or call us directly on any of our contact lines, either in Boston, Johannesburg, Dubai, UAE, or in York, UK. So thanks again for connecting. Enjoy what remains of the day. Bye-bye.